The icy wind howled, but Sarah refused to give up. After 12 hours of painstaking work, her masterpiece stood tall. A magnificent snowman, adorned with a scarf and carrot nose. But as she admired her creation, a sickening crunch echoed through the silent night. Whipping around, Sarah watched in horror as her neighbor, Karen, trampled the snowman, cackling maniacally. Sarah's fists clenched, her heart racing. This was war. Sarah stared in disbelief as Karen stomped on the remains of her beloved snowman. "What the hell is wrong with you?" she yelled, storming across the freshly fallen snow. Karen sneered, her icy blue eyes glinting with malice. "Your monstrosity is ruining the aesthetic of our neighborhood. As the HOA president, I have the authority to remove any eyesores." "Eyesore. This is art." Sarah gestured wildly at the crushed snowman. "You just destroyed hours of hard work." "Well, now it's gone," Karen said smugly. "And if you try to rebuild it, I'll have it removed again." Sarah's blood boiled. "You can't just." "I can, and I will," Karen interrupted, turning on her heel. "This neighborhood has standards to uphold." Seething, Sarah watched as Karen sauntered back to her pristine, impeccably landscaped yard. She clenched her fists, nails digging into her palms. There was no way she was letting that battle axe ruin her fun. The next morning, Sarah bundled up and marched outside, determined to rebuild her snowman. As she began packing the snow, she heard the unmistakable crunch of boots behind her. "I thought I made myself clear," Karen sneered, her gaze fixed on the growing snowman. Sarah whirled around, eyes narrowed. "And I thought I made it clear that I don't care what you think." Karen's lips curled in a sneer. "You have until sundown to remove that eyesore, or I'll have it taken care of." "Try it," Sarah shot back, "and I'll make sure the entire neighborhood knows what a power-hungry tyrant you are." Karen's eyes widened, and for a moment, Sarah thought she might back down. But then the older woman's expression hardened. "Don't say I didn't warn you." As Karen stalked away, Sarah turned back to her snowman, a plan forming in her mind. This time, she wasn't going to let Karen win. Over the next few hours, Sarah worked tirelessly, reinforcing her creation with layers of compacted snow and ice. By the time the sun began to set, her snowman was a towering fortress, impervious to Karen's destructive attempts. Sarah stepped back, admiring her handiwork. "Just try and knock you down now, you witch," she muttered. As the last rays of daylight faded, Sarah heard the familiar crunch of Karen's footsteps approaching. She braced herself, ready to defend her snowman at all costs. "I told you to remove this eyesore," Karen growled, glaring at the massive snowman. "And I told you I don't care what you think," Sarah shot back. "This snowman is staying." Karen's eyes narrowed, and she stepped closer, her hand reaching out as if to push the snowman over. But as she made contact, a loud crack echoed through the night, followed by the sickening crunch of metal. Sarah's eyes widened as she watched, horrified and mesmerized, as Karen's pristine SUV, parked just a few feet away, was crushed beneath the weight of the collapsing snowman. Karen let out a piercing scream, stumbling backward, her face a mask of pure terror. Sarah couldn't help but feel a surge of vindictive satisfaction as she watched the woman who had tormented her for years finally get her comeuppance. As the last of the snowman's icy remains settled around the mangled wreckage of Karen's SUV, Sarah couldn't resist a triumphant grin. "Looks like your precious neighborhood standards just got a little more icy." The silence that followed was deafening. Karen stood there, mouth agape, eyes wide with shock and disbelief. Sarah watched, a mixture of triumph and trepidation washing over her. "You," Karen sputtered, her voice trembling. "You did this on purpose." Sarah raised her hands in a placating gesture. "Whoa, Karen, let's not get carried away here. I didn't mean for this to happen. I was just trying to build a snowman, and you insisted on destroying it." "Bullshit," Karen spat, her face flushing with rage. "You rigged that thing to collapse on my car. This is vandalism, pure and simple." Sarah felt a pang of guilt, but her determination quickly overshadowed it. "Look, Karen, I know you're upset, but you brought this on yourself. If you hadn't been so hell-bent on destroying my snowman, none of this would have happened." Karen's eyes narrowed to slits. "You're going to pay for this, Sarah. I'm going to make sure the entire neighborhood knows what a vindictive, childish brat you are." "Go ahead," Sarah said, squaring her shoulders. "But I'll make sure they know the truth, that you've been harassing me and my family for years, and that this is just the latest in a long line of your petty power trips." Karen opened her mouth to retort, but before she could, the sound of sirens pierced the air. Both women turned to see a police car pulling up to the curb, its lights flashing. "Looks like your little stunt just got you in some serious trouble," Karen sneered, a malicious grin spreading across her face. Sarah's heart raced as the officer approached, his expression unreadable. "Ma'am, we've received a report of property damage. Can you tell me what happened here?" Karen wasted no time in launching into her side of the story, painting Sarah as the vengeful villain who had deliberately sabotaged her vehicle. Sarah listened, her stomach churning, as the officer jotted down notes. When Karen had finished, the officer turned to Sarah, his gaze stern. "And what's your side of the story, ma'am?" Sarah took a deep breath, her mind racing. She knew she had to tread carefully. One wrong move, and she could be facing serious consequences. But as she looked at the crushed SUV, a spark of defiance ignited within her. "Officer, I was simply trying to build a snowman in my own yard when my neighbor, Karen, decided to destroy it. I tried to reason with her, but she refused to listen. So I reinforced the snowman to protect it, but I never intended for it to collapse on her car. This was an accident, pure and simple." The officer's brow furrowed as he considered Sarah's words. "And can you explain how the snowman ended up crushing the vehicle?" Sarah steeled herself, knowing that her next words could make or break her case. "Well, officer, Karen was intent on pushing the snowman over, even after I told her to leave it alone. I guess the structure just couldn't withstand the force of her attack." The officer's gaze shifted between the two women, his expression unreadable. Sarah held her breath, praying that he would see the truth in her words. After what felt like an eternity, the officer let out a deep sigh. "All right, ladies, here's what's going to happen." The officer's gaze shifted between the two women, his expression unreadable. Sarah held her breath, praying that he would see the truth in her words. After what felt like an eternity, the officer let out a deep sigh. "All right, ladies, here's what's going to happen. I'm going to need you both to come down to the station and give your statements. We'll review the evidence and determine if any charges are warranted." Karen's face lit up with triumph, while Sarah felt her heart sink. "But officer, this was clearly an accident," she pleaded. "Karen was the one who attacked my snowman in the first place." The officer raised a hand, silencing her. "I understand, ma'am, but the law is the law. We'll need to investigate this properly." Karen shot Sarah a smug look. "Don't worry, officer, I'll be sure to cooperate fully. After all, I'm the law-abiding citizen here." Sarah glared at her neighbor, biting back a scathing retort. As the officer ushered them into the back seat of the patrol car, she couldn't help but feel a growing sense of dread. This was exactly the kind of power play she had been trying to avoid. The ride to the police station was tense and silent, save for the occasional sniffle from Karen, who seemed to be reveling in her apparent victory. Sarah, on the other hand, was consumed by a whirlwind of emotions: anger, fear, and a stubborn determination to prove her innocence. Once they arrived, the officer led them to a small interrogation room, where they were instructed to wait for a detective to arrive. Sarah fidgeted nervously, her mind racing with possible scenarios and potential defenses. After what felt like an eternity, the door finally swung open, and a grizzled-looking detective stepped inside. He eyed the two women with a mix of skepticism and disinterest. "All right, let's hear it," he said, settling into a chair across the table. "Ms. Daniels, you first." Karen launched into her account of the events, painting Sarah as a vindictive and unstable neighbor who had deliberately sabotaged her vehicle. Sarah listened, her fists clenched tightly under the table, as the detective scribbled notes. When Karen had finished, the detective turned to Sarah, his gaze unwavering. "And your side of the story, Ms. Wilkins." Sarah took a deep breath, trying to keep her voice steady. "Detective, this was all a terrible accident. Karen has been harassing me and my family for years, ever since we moved into the neighborhood. She's the president of the HOA, and she's used that position to make our lives miserable." The detective raised a hand, silencing her. "I'm not interested in your personal feud with your neighbor, ma'am. I need you to stick to the facts of what happened tonight." Sarah felt a surge of frustration, but she forced herself to remain calm. "Okay, well, the facts are that I was building a snowman in my yard, and Karen decided to come over and destroy it. I tried to reason with her, but she refused to listen. So I reinforced the snowman to protect it, but I never intended for it to collapse on her car. It was an accident, plain and simple." The detective studied her for a moment, his brow furrowed in thought. "And can you explain how the snowman ended up crushing the vehicle?" Sarah swallowed hard, knowing that her next words could make or break her case. "Well, detective, Karen was determined to push the snowman over, even after I told her to leave it alone. I guess the structure just couldn't withstand the force of her attack." The detective's gaze hardened, and Sarah felt her heart sink. "That's a pretty convenient excuse, Ms. Wilkins. You expect me to believe that this was all just a freak accident." Sarah opened her mouth to protest, but the detective raised a hand, silencing her. "I'm going to need to see the evidence before I make any decisions here. In the meantime, you're both free to go, but I'll be in touch." As they walked out of the police station, Sarah could feel Karen's triumphant gaze burning into the back of her head. She knew that this was far from over, and that the battle for her freedom had only just begun. The drive home was tense and silent, the weight of the situation pressing down on Sarah like a heavy fog. She could feel Karen's smug satisfaction radiating from the passenger seat, and it took every ounce of her self-control not to lash out. As they pulled into the driveway, Sarah caught a glimpse of her husband, Brody, waiting anxiously on the porch. The moment he saw them, he rushed down the steps, his eyes filled with concern. "What the hell happened?" he demanded, his gaze darting between the two women. Sarah opened her mouth to speak, but Karen beat her to it. "Your wife here has been arrested for destroying my property," she declared, her voice dripping with false indignation. Brody's eyes widened, and he turned to Sarah, his brow furrowed in confusion. "Arrested? What is she talking about?" Sarah quickly explained the events of the evening, her voice trembling with a mix of frustration and fear. Brody listened intently, his expression darkening with each passing moment. "That's ridiculous," he exclaimed, stepping between Sarah and Karen. "Karen, you've been harassing our family for years, and now you're trying to throw Sarah in jail for your own petty vendetta." Karen's eyes narrowed, and she drew herself up to her full height. "I don't know what kind of lies your wife has been feeding you, but the facts are clear. She deliberately sabotaged my vehicle, and she's going to pay for it." Brody let out a humorless laugh. "You know, Karen, I've always wondered why the rest of the neighborhood seems to put up with your nonsense. But now I see it's because they're all too afraid to stand up to you." Karen's face flushed with anger, and she opened her mouth to retort, but Brody cut her off. "Save it, Karen. We're done here. If you think for 1 second that we're going to let you ruin Sarah's life, you've got another thing coming." With that, Brody turned and ushered Sarah into the house, his hand gentle but firm on her shoulder. As the door closed behind them, Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her, but the knot of worry in her stomach refused to loosen. "Brody, what are we going to do?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Her husband pulled her into a tight embrace, his strong arms offering a moment of comfort amidst the chaos. "Don't worry, Sarah," he murmured. "We're going to fight this, no matter what it takes." Sarah nodded, her mind racing with possibilities. She knew that Karen was a formidable opponent, and that the road ahead would be long and arduous. But with Brody by her side, she felt a renewed sense of determination. "All right," she said, straightening her shoulders, "let's start planning our strategy." The two of them spent the rest of the night poring over potential legal avenues, discussing witness testimonies, and exploring ways to discredit Karen's version of events. Sarah could feel the weight of the situation bearing down on her. But with each new idea, a spark of hope began to flicker in her chest. As the first rays of dawn crept through the window, Brody reached across the table and squeezed Sarah's hand. "We're going to get through this, I promise. Karen won't know what hit her." Sarah managed a weary smile, her grip tightening around his fingers. "I know, Brody. And this time, I'm not going to let her win." The next few days were a whirlwind of activity as Sarah and Brody worked tirelessly to build their case against Karen. They reached out to neighbors, gathered witness statements, and combed through every detail of the incident, determined to uncover the truth. Sarah's heart raced with a mix of anxiety and determination as she waited for the detective's call. She knew that the outcome of this investigation could have far-reaching consequences, not just for her, but for her entire family. When the call finally came, Sarah felt a surge of adrenaline. "Detective, thank you for getting in touch. What can you tell me about the investigation?" The detective's voice was matter-of-fact, but Sarah detected a hint of uncertainty. "Well, Ms. Wilkins, we've reviewed the evidence, and it's a bit of a complex situation." Sarah gripped the phone tighter, her knuckles turning white. "What do you mean, complex? Is Karen pressing charges?" "That's the thing," the detective replied. "We're not entirely sure. Your neighbor's story has some inconsistencies, and the physical evidence doesn't fully support her account." Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her, but she didn't dare let her guard down. "So, what happens now?" "We'd like you and your husband to come down to the station and give a more detailed statement," the detective explained. "We want to get a clearer picture of what really happened that night." Sarah couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope. "Absolutely, we'll be there as soon as we can." As she hung up the phone, Brody looked at her expectantly. "Well, what did the detective say?" Sarah couldn't hold back a smile. "They want us to come in and give our side of the story. The investigation isn't going as smoothly for Karen as she'd hoped." Brody let out a sigh of relief, his shoulders visibly relaxing. "That's good news. Maybe we finally caught a break." The drive to the police station was tense, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that the tide was turning in their favor. When they arrived, the detective greeted them with a nod and ushered them into the same interrogation room as before. "All right, folks, let's start from the beginning," the detective said, his tone more open and engaged than during their previous encounter. Sarah and Brody took turns recounting the events of that fateful night, emphasizing the history of harassment they had endured from Karen and the fact that the Snowman's collapse was truly an accident. The detective listened intently, occasionally jotting down notes. When they had finished, the detective leaned back in his chair, a thoughtful expression on his face. "Okay, so here's what I'm gathering from all this. Karen's version of events doesn't quite line up with the physical evidence, and your story seems to be corroborated by the neighbors we've spoken to." Sarah felt a surge of relief, but she knew better than to let her guard down. "So, what does that mean for me? Am I still in trouble?" The detective held up a hand. "Well, that's the thing. After reviewing everything, we don't believe you intentionally sabotaged Karen's vehicle. It seems more like a case of unfortunate circumstances." Brody let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "So, you're saying Sarah isn't going to be charged?" The detective nodded. "That's right. We're going to classify this as an accident and close the case. As long as you two agree to keep the peace going forward, I don't see any reason to pursue this further." Sarah felt a wave of relief and gratitude wash over her. "Thank you, Detective. You have no idea how much this means to us." The detective offered a small smile. "Just try to avoid any more Snowman-related incidents, okay? I don't think my heart could take it." As they walked out of the police station, Sarah felt a weight lift from her shoulders. Brody pulled her into a tight embrace, and she could feel the tension melting away. "I knew we could do it," Brody murmured, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. Sarah nodded, a smile spreading across her face. "Yeah, and I have a feeling this isn't the last we've seen of Karen's antics." Brody chuckled, his arm tightening around her waist. "Well, then we'll be ready. No more snowman-crushing SUVs, though, okay?" Sarah laughed, the sound of her joy echoing through the crisp winter air. "Deal." With the criminal investigation behind them, Sarah and Brody turned their attention to the next battle, dealing with Karen and the HOA. "She's not going to let this go," Sarah said, pacing the living room. "I can already imagine the kind of smear campaign she's going to launch against us." Brody nodded, his brow furrowed in thought. "You're right. We need to be proactive if we're going to keep her from making our lives hell." The two of them spent the next few days strategizing, reaching out to their neighbors, and gathering support for their cause. They knew that taking on the HOA president was no small feat, but they were determined to fight for their right to express themselves, even if it meant waging a war of words. When the next HOA meeting rolled around, Sarah and Brody braced themselves for the confrontation. As they entered the community center, they were greeted by a room full of familiar faces, some sympathetic, others clearly in Karen's pocket. Karen stood at the front of the room, her icy blue eyes narrowed as she spotted the couple. "Well, well, if it isn't the Wilkins family," she drawled, her lips curling into a sneer. "I'm so glad you could join us today." Sarah felt Brody's hand on the small of her back, a silent show of support. "Karen," she said, her voice steady, "we're here to address the ongoing harassment we've been facing from you and the HOA." A murmur rippled through the crowd, and Karen's expression darkened. "Harassment? I have no idea what you're talking about. We're simply trying to maintain the high standards of our community." Brody stepped forward, his gaze unwavering. "That's a load of crap, and you know it. You've been using your position as HOA president to bully our family and make our lives miserable." Karen's eyes narrowed, and she opened her mouth to retort, but Sarah cut her off. "Look, we all know what happened with the Snowman incident, and we're here today to demand that you stop this petty vendetta and start treating us with the same respect you expect from everyone else." The room fell silent, and Sarah could feel the weight of dozens of eyes upon her. She refused to back down, her chin held high. After a moment, a voice from the back of the room spoke up. "You know, Karen, she's got a point. The way you've been treating the Wilkins family is pretty ridiculous." Sarah felt a surge of hope as more voices chimed in, each one adding their support to her cause. Even some of the HOA board members seemed to be wavering, their expressions uncertain. Karen's face flushed with anger, and she raised a hand to silence the crowd. "This is outrageous. I will not be bullied in my own community. The Wilkins family is clearly a disruptive influence, and I motion that we take immediate action to have them removed from the neighborhood." The room erupted in a chorus of protests, with several residents standing up to defend Sarah and Brody. Sarah felt a sense of triumph as she watched Karen's power and influence start to crumble. Finally, one of the board members, an elderly woman named Mrs. Fitzgerald, raised her hand. "I'm sorry, Karen, but I simply can't support your motion. The Wilkins family has been upstanding members of this community, and they have a right to express themselves, even if it doesn't align with your personal preferences." Karen's face twisted with fury, but before she could respond, Mrs. Fitzgerald continued. "I think it's time we take a long, hard look at the way the HOA has been run. Perhaps it's time for some new leadership. Leadership that's more concerned with bringing our community together than tearing it apart. The room erupted in thunderous applause, and Sarah felt a grin spreading across her face. She had won. As Karen stormed out of the meeting, Brody pulled Sarah into a tight embrace. "I told you we'd get through this," he murmured. Sarah nodded, her eyes shining with tears of relief and triumph. "Yeah, and I have a feeling this is just the beginning." In the aftermath of the HOA meeting, Sarah and Brody found themselves thrust into the spotlight as the champions of the community. Word of their standoff with Karen had spread like wildfire, and they soon found themselves the recipients of endless congratulations and well wishes from their neighbors. "I can't believe you two actually stood up to that woman," their neighbor, Mrs. Fitzgerald, said, shaking her head in disbelief. "We've all been too afraid to challenge her, but you showed us that it can be done." Sarah smiled, feeling a sense of pride and accomplishment. "Well, we couldn't just sit back and let her bully us anymore. Someone had to take a stand." Brody nodded, his arm wrapped around Sarah's waist. "And we're glad that the rest of the community was willing to support us. It's been a long time coming." As the days passed, Sarah and Brody found themselves at the center of a growing movement to reform the HOA. Neighbors who had previously been too intimidated to speak up were now coming forward, sharing their own stories of Karen's abuses of power. "She's been misusing HOA funds for her own personal projects," one resident revealed, his eyes narrowed in anger. "And she's been blacklisting anyone who dares to challenge her. Not to mention the way she's been harassing the Wilkins family," another neighbor chimed in. "It's just unacceptable." Sarah and Brody listened intently, their resolve hardening with each new revelation. They knew that taking down the HOA president would be no easy feat, but they were determined to see it through. Over the next few weeks, they worked tirelessly, gathering evidence, rallying support, and strategizing their next moves. They reached out to local media outlets, sharing their story and calling for change. "We're not going to let Karen continue to abuse her power," Sarah told a reporter, her voice steady and unwavering. "This is our community, and we deserve to have a say in how it's run." The article quickly went viral, sparking outrage and support across the neighborhood and beyond. Suddenly, the Wilkins family found themselves at the center of a much larger battle, one that transcended the boundaries of their small community. As the pressure mounted, Karen grew increasingly desperate, lashing out at Sarah and Brody with even greater intensity. She attempted to have them fined for minor infractions, threatened to take away their voting rights in the HOA, and even tried to rally her remaining supporters to turn the community against them. But Sarah and Brody refused to be intimidated. They stood firm, rallying their neighbors and drawing strength from the growing movement for change. "We're not going to back down," Brody told the community at a town hall meeting. "Karen's reign of terror ends now." The crowd erupted in thunderous applause, and Sarah felt a surge of pride and determination. They were on the verge of a victory, and she knew that the path forward would not be easy. But with the support of their community, they were ready to take on the challenge. As the meeting drew to a close, Sarah caught sight of Karen, her face twisted with rage and desperation. Their eyes locked, and Sarah couldn't help but feel a sense of vindication. "It's over, Karen," she murmured, a small smile playing on her lips. "Your time is up." In the weeks that followed, the battle for control of the HOA raged on, with Sarah and Brody at the forefront of the movement for change. They organized community events, rallied their neighbors, and tirelessly worked to expose Karen's corruption and misuse of power. The pressure on Karen was mounting, and she fought back with increasing desperation, lashing out at Sarah and Brody with ever greater intensity. But the Wilkins family remained steadfast, their resolve only growing stronger as they witnessed the community rally behind them. Finally, the day of the pivotal HOA election arrived, and the entire neighborhood turned out in force. Sarah and Brody stood side by side, their hands clasped tightly, as the votes were tallied. When the results were announced, The crowd erupted into a deafening roar. Karen had been decisively voted out, and a new, more community-oriented slate of board members had been elected, with Sarah and Brody as the clear leaders of the movement. As the newly appointed HOA president, Sarah took the podium, her eyes shining with pride and determination. Today, we've taken a major step forward in reclaiming our community. No longer will we be held hostage by the whims of a power-hungry few. From this day forward, we will work together to create a neighborhood that truly reflects the values and aspirations of all its residents. The crowd cheered and applauded, and Sarah felt a sense of triumph and relief wash over her. Beside her, Brody beamed, his arm wrapped protectively around her waist. In the days that followed, Sarah and Brody set to work implementing their vision for the HOA, drawing on the energy and enthusiasm of their neighbors. They launched new community initiatives, revamped the bylaws to prevent future abuses of power, and worked tirelessly to heal the divisions that had plagued the neighborhood for so long. And as for Karen, she slunk away into the shadows, her dreams of HOA domination shattered. Occasionally, Sarah would catch glimpses of her scowling face as she passed by, but the former president never dared to confront the Wilkins family again. As the seasons changed and the years passed, the Wilkins family became a symbol of hope and resilience, inspiring other communities to stand up and fight for their rights. And every winter, as the first snow began to fall, Sarah would look out the window and marvel at the towering, unbreakable snowman that stood guard in her yard, a testament to the power of determination and the triumph of the human spirit.